about it. Adrian Piper is a very interesting artist who's done really a variety of types of work. Identity, this idea of identity, is really important in this respect. And one of the things about identity as, say, the content of an artist's work, when you look at it historically, through the 60s and 70s, it tends to be more about race and ethnicity. As you shift into the 80s, it tends to be more about sexuality and sexual politics. And so that's something we'll also kind of track as well. Which is not to say there isn't work about both of these happening in those time frames, but there tends to be a kind of pattern. So for Adrian Piper, her the identity aspect is really having to do with racial, ethnic issues or concerns, and then also in terms of being a woman as well. So this is a piece she did called Political Self-Portrait. She did a whole series of these. And she is a black woman who's very light-skinned and for whom people often assume that she's white. And so in this series of images, one of the things that she was doing is she was essentially telling stories. There's like narratives that are embedded in these works. And this is the typed, part of the piece. And if you spend time with it, you can kind of read where she's basically, essentially she's kind of combining stories. And so it's very journalistic. And I don't mean like journalism, like, professional journalism, but like writing in a journal. So it's very journalistic, where she's revisiting these events in a sense that have happened to her, where people have made assumptions about her, in particular about her gender, and what happens when people assume that she's white, and what happens when people realize that she's not, or that's not necessarily the way that she identifies. And then the image that you see here is kind of, is a split image where it's a positive and negative image. That's like, and kind of she's playing with language as well. She also did a series of performance-based pieces where and this is where the gender comes in a little bit too, is that she dressed as a man, and she dressed more identifiably as a black man, like in terms of the way she was dressed. She, wore a wig that kind of looked more like a natural, kind of Afro style hair. She had a mustache and so on. So she had these markers that, kind of, cued people in. And then she would walk through the streets of New York. She had a photographer with her to document what would happen. And so what she was interested in is what happens when she's interacting with people and they assume that she's either a white woman or a black woman. What happens when they make assumptions if she's a man, in particular a black man. And so there's a lot of, it's almost like sociological kind of studies that are happening as well. One of the works, and these are they're rather fluxus in nature, but they're kind of performative based in a sense. But thinking about them in a fluxus way is probably a good way to consider it. Was a series referred to as the calling card series. And she did a number of these, again, as you can see here, between an extended period of time, so from 1986 to 1990. And what would happen was, and what some of them deal with gender, some of them deal with ethnicity. So I think as you read it, it kind of makes sense. These are basically the size of business cards. So they're easy, she could keep a bunch of them, in her purse or pocket or whatever. And so when she found herself in this situation, she'd hand them a card. So so in this case here, this one having to do with gender. She says, "Dear friend, I'm not here to pick anyone up or to be picked up. I am here alone because I want to be here alone. This card is not intended as part of an extended, flirtation. Thank you for respecting my privacy." And so this would be handed out in a situation where, some guy sees that she's by herself, and starts, talking to her and so on. And the interesting thing I find about this, or even it's just, kind of when we think of like catcalling, or I think that's probably, that's a word still used today, catcalling. And it's really interesting because in the last year or so, there has been a lot about that, especially in social media. But we've got a number of recent graduates who are in New York City. One of them in particular, I've had some conversations with her about this, and she's talked about how it's just endemic across the city, is that, you're walking somewhere and guys are like checking you out and talking to you, and it's just like, kind of walking with you down the street, and it's really frustrating. And it's even worse, like when it's in the warmer months as well. And then, are you familiar with, there's like a video that came out where a woman was walking and like 10 hours walking around the city? That kind of was a thing a couple of months ago, maybe it's fairly recent. So this is, kind of coming out of that dynamic, and in some ways, maybe this hasn't changed. Her reason for the calling cards is that she wanted it to be a non-threatening interaction. She didn't want to get into like a verbal sparring match, with somebody over the situation. She wanted it to, the person to be reflective potentially. So rather than engaging with them and saying, "Hey, why are you doing this?" That tends to make people, be more defensive. She just gave them a card, and move on. So there were these calling cards, and there was also another set of cards here that was very similar. And in this one, she says, "Dear friend, I am Black. I'm sure you did not realize this when you made or laughed at or agreed with that racist remark. In the past, I've attempted to alert white people to my racial identity in advance. Unfortunately, this invariably causes them to react to me as pushy, manipulative, or socially inappropriate. Therefore, my policy is to assume that white people do not make these remarks even when they believe there are no Black people present, and to distribute this card when they do. I regret any discomfort my presence is causing you, just as I am sure you regret the discomfort your racism is causing me." Yeah, and so again, the dynamic is to kind of put this information forward, kind of call people out in a sense, but to allow them to have some self-reflection without confrontation and without immediately, kind of putting up their defenses. The interesting thing about this is one of the reasons why she stopped this project was because people were essentially, because the work became known, basically, and people started harassing her in one way or another so they'd get a card. And so when that started happening, she realized it was time, and in a sense, maybe there's a certain amount of success to that, but she stopped the project because it stopped to function in the way that she, the initial way that she wanted it to work. But I think it's interesting. I mean, there's this idea of trying to, by interacting with people in a non-threatening kind of way, there's this desire that, perhaps, you can make the world a better place. One of the things about Piper's work, too, is that not all of it, certainly, but a lot of it is very text-based, where language is being presented, at the artwork. As the artwork, it's also performative. And you also see this happening, you see this in other artists' work, you also see it happening with the Guerrilla Girls. And the video we watched in class, I think 2 class periods ago, there was an interview with one of the Guerrilla Girls was interviewed in it, and so you got some information there. The Guerrilla Girls were formed in the mid-'80s, and at this point, the interesting thing here, in 1985, depending on what part of the year it was, I was a freshman or sophomore in college, so an art major at this point. When this was formed, this was something that was, I was aware of at this time frame. The idea of the Guerrilla Girls is that they were basically formed to critique the art world with the goal of reforming the art world, but they had to be very careful about it. So they're playing on this idea of a gorilla, certainly like the animal gorilla, so they're wearing gorilla masks, but they're also playing on this idea of what we think of as like guerrilla warfare, right? So that's GUE, and it's the way it's spelled. You see on the one side there. So they're within the system. It's kind of like they're hiding in the jungle, right? Kind of making these attacks, but they have to protect their identities. And one of the things they've talked about as the group is that, some of the women who are a part of the group are not very well-known artists. Some of the women who are part of the group are very well-known artists. And so there's this desire to kind of protect everybody, in this respect by being anonymous. When they appear in public, this is when they first appeared in the 80s. This was more recently in the early 90s, I think, kind of mid-late 90s. Is that when they adopt the name of a woman artist, a historical woman artist, like Frida Kahlo or Artemisia or something like that. So they have this kind of public persona. And what they first started doing was creating flyers or kind of posters, such as we see here, pasting them up around New York, especially in the art-saturated areas of New York. And there was important also that they used humor as well. So there's humor, but it's a sarcastic or a caustic kind of humor. So does this here, the advantages of being a woman artist means working without the pressure of success, not having to be in shows with men, having an escape from the art world and your 4 freelance jobs, knowing your career might pick up after you're 80, and that's a reference to Louise Bourgeois in particular. being reassured that whatever kind of art you make, it will be labeled as feminine, not being stuck in a tenured teaching position. And especially in the 80s, it's much less so today, but in the 80s, there was this pattern that when you looked at the number of men and women in art school, it was about 50-50. When you go to graduate school, it would drop where there were more men than women. And then when you looked at teaching positions, way more men and a few women. So there was this kind of disparity. And that's come closer to evening out in our own time. Others are, seeing your ideas live on in the work of others. And there's lots of people you could think of in that position, but probably most famously, Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner. Having the opportunity to choose between career and motherhood, because there was and it still kind of hangs there today, but I think that's an area where there's been much improvement. It used to be that if you had a family, you wouldn't get a teaching position, or you might not have a career if you had a family, essentially, because people wouldn't think you were serious in that respect. Not having to choke on those big cigars or paint in Italian suits, having more time to work when your mate dumps you for someone younger. Being included in revised versions of art history, right? Every time a new version comes out, it seems like there's another woman artist in there, and that certainly was happening in the 80s. Because in the early 80s, most art history texts had no women at all, which I think, by our standards today is kind of shocking. Not having to undergo the embarrassment of being called a genius, and getting your picture in the art magazines wearing a gorilla suit. So there was an anonymous artist who was also a woman who gave them money to start running these in art news, which was kind of a general, kind of really broad readership. And they wanted broad readership as opposed to something like, say, Art Forum, which is really more specific to contemporary art, because they're really, we're talking more broadly. This was one of their kind of well-known images as well, again, very graphic. And if you think about graphic design in the 80s, black, white, graphic image, text, kind of lots of white space. That's one of the earmarks, sort of the time period. And so this one here, it gives you this, visual to go with it. Women in America earn only 2/3 of what men do. Women artists earn only 1/3 of what men do within that time frame. And I saw this in art news when I was an undergraduate, and it sort of, enraged me at the time. And I photocopied, I don't know how many, made a bunch of photocopies of them, put them up around the art department, and was really shocked at what happened. A lot of them just disappeared, and a lot of people started writing on it and all that white space, and they wrote really hateful things like women artists aren't as good as men, and some other really crude things as well. And that was really kind of a wake-up call. And because there was, by writing on them, there's this kind of anonymity. I have no idea, who wrote those things. But it felt in some ways that, people's attitudes came through. If we think about this within the context of our own time, this was information that was released last year, and that based on the 2010 census, which was the most recent census, on average, women earn today still 77% of what men earn. So there's improvement, but not a huge amount. And then the White House had released this graphic with information that, and they were trying to put this into real terms, is that, and so this is over the course of a career, a typical woman working full-time in the U.S. Loses, almost $500,000. Again, this is over time, and then they're, again, graphically, and this is kind of nice too, this is sort of contemporary graphics, compared to graphics from the 80s, but, these are the things you could do with that money: buy a house, put 2 kids through college, buy almost 22,000 gallons of gas, or feed a family of 4 for about 6.5 years. So that gender gap, is still really significant today. Another well-known graphic that they created, they would often do surveys. So they would essentially critique places where art was shown. So commercial galleries, but also museums, and essentially do calculations. How many women artists, and so on. And this is some examples of that work on the street, and then Guerrilla Girls themselves start getting into museum and gallery spaces. But they had this very famous graphic that even showed up on some billboards. It just said, do women have to be naked to get into the Metropolitan Museum? Less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of the nudes are female. And so they begin kind of calling attention to these dynamics. And then they've revisited this over time. So in 1989, the first time they did this, the percentage was 5% to 85%. In 2005, it dropped to 3% to 83%. And then in 2012, 4% to 76%. So these kind of shifts happen, but they have a tendency to remain roughly the same. The Guerrilla Girls are still active. There are now kind of two branches. There's the West Coast group that's New York based. There's East Coast that's New York based. There's a West Coast group that's LA based, and they still produce graphics over the time period. They have a pretty good website, and you can see all of the stuff that they've made. They've also have an interesting series where they've created these posters as if they're handwritten to gallery owners. They'll say, they say, "Dear so and so, we realize that you don't mean to do this, but we've discovered that there's a disproportionate number of women artists and so on." So they've really been coming at it from lots of different angles. They've also, probably in the last 10 years or so, they've been going outside of the art world, and in particular, maybe more like 15 years, they've been critiquing the entertainment industry more broadly, specifically the film industry. And so they've been drawing attention to this disparity between women filmmakers, male filmmakers, how many women are getting awards versus their male counterparts, and also the pay as well, and finding big disparities there. And that's primarily coming from the LA-based group, who's really in the center of the entertainment world there. So there's still, there have been some schisms within the group. Every once in a while you read about there being kind of a fight between the East Coast and West Coast group, but they're still active. And various individuals travel around the country and give lectures and talks as well. I was talking to an artist friend of mine who was probably like in her 30s or so, in the 80s, and living in New York. And she said it was really interesting at that time because everybody was talking about the Guerrilla Girls in the sense of, do you know, there's this kind of thing like, do you know who they are, and it's interesting because you think people will be able to figure it out, but she said the dynamic of the time is oftentimes that nobody was really sure who was and who wasn't. And that's kind of an interesting dynamic. You might be careful about what you say or don't say. Maybe if you thought somebody might be a part of the group. But again, we're kind of moving forward and back through time with Wadsworth Jarrell. Oops, I didn't put his name there. The artist's name here is Wadsworth Jarrell. I think it's 2 R's and 2 L's. So I'm going to double check that. So Wadsworth Jarrell was a painter who was part of a group known as Afrocobra. And the idea of Afrocobra was that it wasn't as political as the Black Power movement or the Black Panthers in general, but it was oftentimes considered to be a sort of visual equivalent in a lot of ways, or that the two, sort of partnered together. The idea of Afrocobra was that it did have some sting to it, and that was, that name Cobra was used intentionally. This work here is really typical of Wadsworth Jarrell's work, where you see really dense imagery. It's certainly clearly understandable. Who's being depicted here? The title of the painting is called Revolutionary. But the person who's being depicted is Angela Davis, who was, we'll talk about in more detail in just a moment to kind of understand this work. But here she's, giving a public speech. So she's there. She looks intense. Her mouth is open. You can see she's holding her hand. She's got speaking through a PA system, and then sort of exploding around her are all of these words. And if you look carefully, there are kind of words and text that are related. Related to speeches, and she also too. This kind of looks a little bit like a bandolero, that contains bullets, and all of those things again make these references specifically to the Black Panthers and connected to this idea of the Black Power movement. And Angela Davis is somebody who really was sort of caught. She was in a lot of ways on the fringe of the Black Panthers. She knew people who were Black Panthers, but she herself was not necessarily a Black Panther. When I was in graduate school, one of my professors, he was known for studying Wadsworth Gerald. He published the main monograph on Gerald. And this is terminology that he uses, and I don't know if anybody else uses it, but when he talked about Gerald and he talks about this kind of imagery, he referred to it as jam-packed imagery. And it's jam-packed visually in a formal way, but it's also jam-packed in terms of content as well. And this is something that's really typical for this particular artist. To understand, I think, this image and sort of the power of Angela Davis, I think it's important to understand a little bit about her. Although I do want to, because we did mention previously the Black Panthers in the last class, and I did a little research in between then and now to make sure I had information correct. One of the things about the Black Panthers, they were founded in 1966, so right in the middle of the 60s. Their center was Oakland, which is also where Angela Davis was living and actually teaching, because she was teaching at Berkeley, and the University of Berkeley, so it's really almost kind of on the line between Berkeley and Oakland. The Black Panthers were essentially a Marxist organization that oftentimes got taught, what they were referred to as communists, but they were really Marxist in nature. And when it was founded, this was their platform, which I think is interesting. And it's very utopian, I think, in a lot of ways. So they had 10 points to their platform. So, and I won't number them, but these are them. So, if you want a copy of this, I can give it to you too. Freedom, or rather, number one is freedom, the power to determine the destiny of Black and oppressed communities. Full employment, guaranteed employment. End to robbery of Black communities, the overdue debt of 40 acres and two mules as promised to ex-slaves during the Reconstruction period following the emancipation of slavery. Decent housing fit for the shelter of human beings. Land should be made into cooperatives on which people can build. Some really deeply revolutionary stuff. Education for the people that teaches the true history of Blacks and their role in present-day society. Free health care, health facilities which emphasize preventive medical programs. End to police brutality and murder of Black people and other people of color and oppressed peoples. End to all wars of aggression. Keep in mind, Vietnam is ramping up at this point. Freedom for political prisoners, and land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, peace, and community control of modern industry. So really, deeply, kind of Marxist ideas. They became really vilified, and the government certainly vilified them, and vilified in the media as well. They were militant, and that there was definitely a part of it, and they grew out of a kind of dissatisfaction with the nonviolence, movement of the civil rights movement itself, kind of under Martin Luther King Jr. that was really espousing nonviolence. What they felt was that would fail. Was their certainly their concerns. They were considered by the late 60s. They were considered to be the primary threat to the United States by the FBI, which I think is interesting. The way when you read what the FBI said, it sounded like they expected the United States to topple at any moment, from the Black Panthers. However, polls from this time period showed that only 5% of African Americans supported them, and 60% strongly opposed them. That overall, people really felt that the civil rights movement and the nonviolence and pacifism was the way that things were going to work, and not through this militant organization. So the reality was they were pretty small, pretty reactionary. They kind of espoused a kind of hard line, kind of violent sort of attitude in some ways, but they really weren't as systemic or as endemic, I think, as people in larger society thought. So the thing about Angela Davis is that she's an interesting, the background on her is really interesting. She, and she's still alive and giving lectures and so on. I saw her give a lecture in the late 90s, and it was, and I have to admit, it was transformative. I was so amazed by the way, and she was talking about prison and prison reform, essentially, and she essentially gave this very, I mean, she is an academic, she gave this academic lecture about the history of prisons and how we're so conflicted about, should prison be about reform or is it punishment? You know, and when we have this conflict, they sort of are, they end up being both and neither. It's a really complicated stuff. So she studied at Brandeis and the University of Frankfurt, which is where she did her PhD. Between 1969 and 70, she was an assistant professor at UC Berkeley. In 1970, she was arrested as an accomplice to murder and then was imprisoned for 2 years. Eventually, she was released on bail, tried, and then acquitted in 1972. So she became a kind of face in some ways to the Black Power movement. So and again, she was very much on the fringe of the Black Panthers. She really was part of Black Power, not necessarily the Black Panther movement. And I think it's interesting to put this within the context of the time. So we're going to watch. Runs probably about 10 minutes. We'll have. Oh gosh, we're not going to have enough time to watch this. We have just 10 minutes. I think. Let me see, because I think it may be. Yeah, it's going to take us to 13 minutes, so we will run out of time. I tell you what, let me put both the Kara Walker and the other on the blog, because you really we need to watch it till the end. Watch both of those, so it'll be like less than 20 minutes of your time between now and Wednesday. Watch both of these before Wednesday. We'll start off class and talk about both of them. So if you have questions, comments, concerns. One thing I will say about this video, it's from a documentary. It includes an interview with her when she was in prison. And interestingly, the documentary was not produced by an American news media. It was produced by Norwegian news media that gave this pretty interesting view. So it's somebody from the outside looking in at America in terms of what's going on. So keep that in mind, and you'll get a sense of that because there's this like Norwegian newscaster guy at the beginning, and it's subtitled in English. So watch those two things. I'll put them on under the supplements and lectures under that heading on the blog, and we'll kick off class next time with a discussion.